Okay, hope you had a great lunch. And if you'll take your seats, we'll get started with this afternoon's program. So we spent the morning talking about what happened 20 years ago. History's great, but it's history. So the panels this afternoon will be looking at, focused on contemporary issues, where we are today, what we've learned in the last 20 years, and the third panel, what our future looks like. The moderator of our panel this afternoon, our first panel, is Admiral Bill Studeman. Again, I suspect known to many of you. He was a director of NSA from 1998 to 1992, and later the deputy director of Central Intelligence. He's got a great panel, an outstanding panel, and so I'll turn it over to him, Admiral Studeman, and let you introduce your panel.
So thank you very much, General. We're the first after lunch, so I guess we're supposed to keep you all awake. Let me say first, as the moderator, that I'm a subscriber to the Eisenhower dictum, which generally means that if you make the problem bigger, it's easier to see the whole problem. So we're going to cover a lot of areas today that maybe go beyond cyber. In fact, I don't even use the term cyber anymore. I talk about cyber, IO, space, etc. We've already had some discussions here about how difficult from an organizing principle it is to try to get your arms around the extreme complexity, high-speed span of issues of which we will touch only probably broadly in this panel with regard to this. So we're the Now panel. Our homework assignment is to assess the sort of the national now, if you will, in cyber and related topics that have evolved since Eligible Receiver 97 20 years ago. We're also supposed to set the stage for the future panel, which will come after us, and we're supposed to also be sufficiently articulate, in my view, that we create considerations for the current and future of cyber, IO, et cetera, training and education, since there's a lot of people here that are involved in that business. To do that, we have four great panelists. I'm not going to actually spend a lot of time, precious time, going into that. You can see who they are in order in the program. Just some brief introductions. I'm going to ask Secretary Krebs to go first from the Department of Homeland Security. And then I'm going to ask General Davis, who was an OSD policy and is now at Palo Alto Networks Federal. And then David Mussington, and then finally to sort of finish off, I'm going to ask Secretary Cambone, who's now at A&M trying to start up a cyber program, to finish up. I'd like us as a motif to stay at about 8, 10, 12 minutes worth of comments. They might be interrupted along the way by me for expanding on whatever the topic might be that's of interest. And then I'd like to finish up sort of talking about a couple of things that I think are really important. Number one, let's try to frame this thing up for the educational community, because I think that cyber is more than technology, and I'll explain what the more is in my own personal view. And then I think we really do have to get to some kind of assessment about where we are, because my personal belief, one could perhaps, since I'm perhaps the oldest person in the room here, one could take a position that we're not in a very good lie with regard to this topic nationally, that we have struggled with this, and that we have a long way to go. And for the future panel that's to follow us, there will be no future unless we essentially find a way to start closing the gap on the threats and reducing our vulnerability. And so with that, let me turn first to Secretary Chris Krebs.
Thanks. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to actually get somewhat outside the Beltway. I've been living nothing but hurricane response for the last 48 days. I've been to Puerto Rico twice, Virgin Islands once. We'll go back to Puerto Rico this week. Been to Texas twice, Florida once. And in that engagement, I've been focusing on a few things. One, kind of as a point man for broader infrastructure restoration efforts, particularly as we think about Puerto Rico right now, with the primary focus on, while the Army Corps and DOE have energy, I'm focusing on communications. Now, generally speaking, I bet what you're saying right now is, what is he talking about? That's not the cybers. Well, it kind of is. So in terms of where DHS is going in partnership with some of the other federal agencies, one of the strongest partnerships I've seen over the last 4 to 6 weeks is with the Department of Energy. We've been lashed up, shoulder by shoulder, starting in Harvey, moving straight forward into Maria right now in Puerto Rico. And while that has been focused on power restoration, what it gives me a lot of hope for as we move into a season of exercises like GridX and Resilient Grid, just some of these cybersecurity related electricity grid exercises, is that I know that I have as strong as a relationship with the Department of Energy and the electric utilities as I would ever need. And we're already focused on a lot of these cybersecurity related issues, so I know who to call, down both in industry and government. Now, stepping back a bit, what is the department's mission in here? And I'm going to use the now phraseology a little bit loosely. I'm going to think the last couple of years and maybe the next year or so, and that's just more for convenience of what I can describe here. So I think everybody probably understands DHS's mission, at least right now, by statute, is generally speaking 2 things. First and foremost is working alongside the Office of Management and Budget in enforcing cyber information security policy across the federal government of the .gov. Great recent example of that is the recent Kaspersky Binding Operational Directive. So we work in support of the departments and agencies, help them understand what their information security risk is, implement and help them implement policies, and where necessary enforce those policies, providing decision support tools, monitoring capabilities, and actual things like Einstein, intrusion detection and prevention services. So systems. So that's half the coin. The other half of the coin is working in support of the critical infrastructure community, providing them information, intelligence, resources, capabilities in terms of understanding what their information security risk might be. That's the example I used as my starter with the electricity subsector. Now, the organization itself that I'm a part of and currently sit as the senior official performing the duties of the undersecretary, the SOAPDUS, of the National Protection and Programs Directorate, NPPD. It's a horrible name, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But so NPPD is responsible for the physical and cybersecurity mission for the Department of Homeland Security. The way I see it right now, we have 3 primary goals. First and foremost is identifying risk and mitigating risk to federal networks and facilities. And that facilities part is, we also sits within my organization, the Federal Protective Service. So they secure GSA owned and operated federal buildings. Second piece of this is identifying and mitigating systemic risk to critical infrastructure. And when you think about that, if you're familiar with Executive Order 13636, Section 9, those are those critical infrastructure facilities that are at greatest risk from a cyber event. And third and finally, top goal for NPPD is it's identifying and enabling best practices for security across the broader critical infrastructure community. And that's kind of the rising tide floats all boats, identifying and supporting activities like the NIST cybersecurity framework, ensuring that we give cost-effective capabilities out to the broader critical infrastructure community, because I'm not going to be able to reach out and touch necessarily every one of them on a daily, ongoing basis. However, those highest risks, those systemic risks on the Section 9 list that might be financial institutions, electricity or utilities, communications, and that list may develop over time into more IT-focused products, shared services, things like that. What is it that I can do both at the top level, top down, and then bottom up? So the problem is right now, if those are my 3 goals within NPPD, I'm not necessarily organized optimally to execute on that mission. And that's why we're working pretty closely with the Hill, specifically Chairman McCall, on this concept that my predecessor, Undersecretary Suzanne Spalding, kicked off about 2 years ago of the reorganization of NPPD into some operational division, which we're now calling the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. It's not the greatest, most handsome title necessarily, but it tells a story, it tells us what we do, and let me roll back to a hurricane example. 2 weeks ago, I was in San Juan, met with Governor Rosselló and his key staff, including some of the communications officials, and we were talking about, alongside the Commandant of the Coast Guard, the Director of TSA, and a couple other DHS luminaries. We went in there and briefed about some of the recovery and restoration efforts. And then I give my spiel about the comm sector and how I'm working with AT&T, Sprint, Claro, all these providers in getting their systems back up and running. So next thing we know, someone from the governor's staff runs into a press event and says, oh, this is great. We've got the federal government here. We've got DHS here. I've got the Secretary of DHS, the Commandant of the Coast Guard, TSA Director, and then the comms guy. Because she didn't understand what NPPD did. She didn't understand what our title was. She couldn't articulate what I brought to the battle every day. So when I think about where the department and where NPPD needs to go, we need to have three things: increased operational efficiency so we can do more cross-functional activities. And if we get into some Q&A, I can talk a little bit about how we're organizing around our election infrastructure initiative and the task force that I kicked off about 2 weeks ago. And we need clarity of roles and responsibilities so that my stakeholders understand what I can do for them. And then third and finally, a little bit of branding help and marketing help so it's easier for me to get out there and recruit talent into the organization. Three key areas that simply put, a slight name change can truly improve, along with some other kind of bits and pieces of the piece of legislation. Got other great stories I can tell about the last 6 or 7 months, but go back to the panel.
Okay, why don't we move on to the second scene setter speaker. I've asked General Davis to talk about the role from his perspective, both in government and in industry, based on his extreme knowledge of this topic. So.
Thank you, sir. And it's an honor to be up here with such distinguished panelists and with all of you. I was talking to a couple of my colleagues this morning about the fact that this whole day has really been, I feel like it's been my life for the last 20 years. Actually, in 1996, as a junior major, I was at U.S. Atlantic Command, and before eligible receiver, there was another classified exercise called Evident Surprise. I was the lead planner for Evident Surprise. And at the end of that exercise, I found myself in a room, a SCIF, a secure compartmented facility at the National Defense University, talking to, outbriefing cabinet officials and either the leader or the deputy of intelligence organizations in the military. And I thought to myself, I was a Ranger at the time, and I thought, well, I can't jump out of planes and kick in doors the rest of my career. This is pretty cool. And at that point, the Army was getting ready to create an information operations functional area. I was one of the very first in the Army to take that path. And ever since then, I've been involved in information operations, and then as a general officer, cyber operations, cyber strategy, cyber policy, international engagement. So it really is a trip down memory lane for me. I'd like to talk about two topics very briefly. The first one is I'd like to look at where we are today through the lens of progress over the last 20 years. And I know, those of us who've been, down in the engine room as we've traveled this journey, it's been very frustrating. It's been very slow and painful. And I certainly don't want to, make my comments sound like I'm trying to spike the ball in the end zone. Far from it. But I do think there has been some progress. And I'd like to kind of highlight, at least I picked a dozen of them, with the exception of the first one in no particular order. The first one we've kind of talked about already, and I'll just give you my view of it, and that's terminology. Having been down this road for the past 20 years, we've got this term called cyber. And I know Dr. Hamre indicated it was probably a mistake to talk about cyber warfare. In my opinion, that term has been the center of gravity and the forcing function by which a lot of the other areas that I'm going to talk about have occurred. A lot of progress is dependent on that because it forced a lot of things. We argued about information warfare and, oh gosh, you can't call it that. We want to do these things short of war to prevent war. So information operations, information assurance, computer network operations, computer network defense, computer network attack, computer network exploitation, global network operations, network warfare. All these terms, I think, kind of blurred the issues. And there are some minuses associated with the term cyber. Like, for instance, I think it's too focused on the medium and not the message. Perhaps that will change in the future, as we talked about before. But I believe that, and it also has some negative connotations in communicating to industry and to the private sector in general. But I do think it has been one of the things that has driven a lot of progress. And so, for better or worse, I think that has been a specific category of progress. Number two, organization and force structure. When I was the deputy at JTF-G&O, in its, I think, third iteration of its name, I remember we only had control over 4 service network operation centers. There were no forces. It was a very limited ability to command and control. You look at what's happened over the course of the last 20 years, the cyber mission force consists of about 8,000 people, if you include the reserve components. And that is something we never had before. I think that's significant progress. I think that there has also been, if you look at most of the commands these days, and we talked about lacking of, I think General Campbell talked about lacking of the ability to have a hub for doing all these things. Most of them now have a J39 shop, or they may call it something different, but it still is the hub of organizational activity and controlling operations that deal with the information space. Number 3, transparency and clarity. My goodness, 20 years ago, we could not have held this conference because of the level of classification. We have really lowered the classification bar significantly, and I think that's been good. I think that, most of the sophisticated capabilities grew up in darkness and anonymity, the world of intelligence, the world of criminal activity, the world of political activism. Once you start putting these capabilities in the hands of uniformed military, I do think it's appropriate to speak with a little bit more transparency and clarity so that you can avoid miscommunication, misperceptions, and the chance of making a mistake in this realm of cyber and having it spill over. Authorities. I remember in 2012, when I was the senior military cyber advisor, we did an exercise for the Senate. About 75 senators showed up for the exercise. And it was the senior people at DHS, DOD, FBI, and the National Security Council, and we walked through a scenario. And at the end of it, one senator, who will remain nameless but happens to be from Maryland, said, so which one of you people is in charge? And nobody could answer the question. And I spent the next year developing something called a bubble chart, which basically outlined roles and responsibility across DHS, FBI, and DOD. And I think those roles and responsibilities are largely still in place today, although people may argue over them. Senior leader involvement in education. I think there's no doubt that, as we say in the military, this is commander's business and not something relegated simply to the IT community, although they still certainly have a role and responsibility. And I can tell you in the private sector, boards and C-suites, this is a topic in just about every boardroom these days. And it's growing in the amount of involvement. Policies and strategies, we have presidential policies. Thanks to Mr. Snowden, you can now read the classified ones that we worked on. We had a strategy in DOD in 2011, and I was responsible for crafting the 2015 strategy. These things, I think, are significant progress. Measuring success and mitigating risk, I believe that at least in DOD, we have moved from a belief that compliance was the full answer into more of an operational readiness assessment. And I think you're starting to see that done in industry as well. And I think things like the NIST framework, a risk management framework, I think they're very powerful things that do represent some success. Is it sufficient? No, but it's a lot better than it was. Training, individual, collective, service, and joint. There's no shortage of, there's Cyber Guard, Cyber Flag, Cyber Endeavor, Cyber Quest. There's There's a long list of cyber exercises that cover all these training. The downside is, and I always feared that these were done in isolation and looking at cyber and not cross-domain, but I believe that is also beginning to improve. Threat, attribution, a positive. Because this has been such an important factor over the last 20 years, we've gotten really good as a government about attribution capabilities, and I'll tell you, in the private sector, it's the same way. Amazing capabilities. It is not as easy today to hide as it used to be 20 years ago. And I think that's appropriate. I think it's good. On the bad side, the threat is also maturing. Compute power is, increasing, the cost is going down, and it's a very highly automated adversary that we're still struggling to keep up with. We've got a law, 2015, that at least initially addressed a lot of the privacy and liability concerns to make it easier for information sharing between public and private organizations. And I think that has been good, because the public-private cooperation and information sharing there's been a lot of progress there, not sufficient. And then finally, the last one was norms. I think what started in the United Nations Group of Government Experts later expanded as a result of President Xi and President Obama making their agreement, and then it went to the G7 and G20. I think that there are norms of responsible behavior during peacetime, of not attacking critical infrastructure, cooperating with legitimate law enforcement investigations, not adversely impacting a nation's CERT capabilities, and not abusing CERTs to do nefarious activities. I think these all represent progress. But it's all been incremental, it's all been insufficient, and we're still chasing behind the threat. So in my opinion, and I'll stop now, maybe we can cover some of the issues of technology in subsequent portions, but I think we are at a crossroads. And I think that unless we do something not incremental but dramatic, I think that we're now at the point where it's no longer just not being able to get to your banking website, or as bad as it is, it's not having your personally identifiable information hijacked, or things that your data held for ransom. That's bad. But now that we're connecting everything, now we're going to put national security and public safety as issues. And I believe that's why we need to take a much broader, much more holistic, and a much more dramatic change for the future.
Thank you, John. Okay, next I'd like to turn to Dr. David Mussington, who is actually one of your fellow academics here at the University of Maryland. But David's been everywhere. He's been in the White House. He's been now in academia. He's been in the analytic corporation kind of business. He's been in the Department of Defense on the policy side. He's worked for the Bank of Canada. So he has probably a very valuable perspective to offer from his point of view.
Thank you, Admiral, and also I'd like to thank colleagues. It's a real honor to be on the stage with people as much experience as it is on display here. First, I'll say where I was 20 years ago. 20 years ago, I was a junior analyst at Rand Corporation, not yet cleared, so not able to read the after-action reports of eligible receiver, but thanks to some helpful project leaders, I was able to get hints about what it said. It was actually the first major project I worked on was doing after-action analysis on those things. And later on, we worked on the first US-UK strategic information warfare exercises, as we called them in those days. So it's interesting how the issues reframe themselves a little bit, but enduring themes. I've been working on and off in this area since then. I've been a CISO, I've been a Chief Security Officer at Amtrak for a while, and I've done some policy work that sort of gave me a valuable filter on what I used to think was possible and what I no longer think is. So that's sort of my frame for these issues. I guess I'm going to take a slightly less sanguine view than I think General Davis took with how we're doing since eligible receiver, since I think that eligible receiver aged very well in terms of the way it framed issues and the way it anticipated the future evolution of threats and threat actor TTPs. I think that it set a pretty high bar for how the United States was going to respond to a set of risk vectors that were incoming then and are incoming now. And I think that it set a high bar against which we can be judged. So my few minutes is going to be an interim judgment, I suppose, about how we did implementing the insights we gained through Eligible Receiver in 1997. So obviously since 97, a number of policy and strategy documents have been released. General Davis went through a few of those. I have a few more to add. Obviously, PDD 63 was influenced by the preceding Marsh Commission and by Eligible Receiver and by parallel exercises that brought into sharp relief the United States, especially DoD's experience with cyber risks. Since then, we've had CNCI, we've had ISACs, we've had HSPD 7, we've had PPD 21, we've had EO 13636, which I worked on a little bit. We've had experiences. A lot of those experiences, however, are breaches. I think I've got a list here of instances where critical infrastructures or USIP were compromised by cyber actors, from as trivial as whatever went on in Estonia, not so trivial, to attacks on Saudi Arabia and Qatar in 2012, to the OPM breach, to the hacking of Ukraine's presidential election in 2014, which I'll get back to in a second, to the cyber attacks in 2008 on Georgia, to the many breaches at DoD and theft of intellectual property from US corporations in the defense sector and out of the defense sector, that show to me a couple of things. First, the defense is not caught up to offense yet, something we knew we needed to do in 1997 in order to do something about pervasive vulnerability in our critical infrastructures. Second point, in terms of norms of armed conflict, we've had a quasi-official process of international discussions through the UNGGE, culminated in a Talon manual and culminating in a number of bilateral agreements espousing norms of interstate interrelation in cybersecurity that haven't really constrained much. I find it difficult to reconcile a list of evolving norms with a list of breaches and attacks such as the one that I just articulated. This is an illustrative list. It's not exhaustive. There are others. Adversary TTPs have advanced. Our defenses have not advanced as far as they might. Where they have advanced, it's been in the predictable places. The Defense Department, defense-facing critical infrastructure. Even our most well-performing commercial critical infrastructures, the electricity grid and financial services that we've already seen, have their challenges. And let me tell you, as a CISO of the Bank of Canada, a central bank north of our border, for a year, the challenges in that sector on the governmental side among the group of 19 are significant, and a lot of them are not technological. They are generational and they are business process. And I guess I just expressed an enduring frustration that early lessons about accountability, about interest, about differences in business culture at different levels in an organization responsible for cyber risk management continue to impede the ability of organizations to get ahead of the curve a little bit. After all, on the threat side, the threat has advanced, the frequency of breaches has increased, the mean time between detection for breaches is still around 140 days, 20 years after eligible receiver. I think that's, let's say, less than stellar performance. I think that there's a number of consequences for this sort of situation, most of which constrain policy in a manner today that exceeds the constraints of the past. So first of all, I think we have stabilized offense dominance due to the ineffectiveness of cyber defenses in both critical infrastructures, platform IT, and other areas. I think that means that, in a sense, the critical infrastructures become a lagging restrictor on the ability of offensive strategies to be successful ultimately. I think second of all, we have pervasive COTS vulnerabilities that remain and are not really being reversed. To the extent that we have critical infrastructures being critical dependencies for government services and for the Defense Department. That again is a lagging restrictor on the progress we can make. I think we confront, and I'm hoping this provokes some comment, I think we confront the limitations of voluntary measures for critical infrastructure cybersecurity. The incentives issue that was pointed out as long ago as Y2K, where private sector businesses simply lack the incentives to do out-of-the-fence comprehensive cyber risk mitigation because they cannot, free rider problems are pervasive. That, again, restricts the ability of our national strategies to achieve secular improvements in cyber risk management. I think lastly, and I've been on the mic a long time here, I'd like to point out a sort of an implication of education, an educational requirement for cyber risk management, which is much as we train people at the operational level to be better and more slottable into the boxes we want to put them in terms of operational response, we don't do that for leaders. And I don't know that when I went to the Pentagon in 2010, leadership other than obviously Bill Lynn and the secretary, were really fully conscious and aware of the pervasive vulnerabilities that they were accepting. I know in the private sector we have some progress, but still not enough and not very deep within most organizations. Right now I'm consulting at NATO, having the same experience there where senior leadership, general officers, flag officers lack basic awareness of risks they're accepting in their business operation. So this is more of a business culture generational issue than it is a technological one. So overall, I guess I'm not sanguine that we've learned the lessons of eligible receiver. Not only that, I think that we should be worried that lessons that were clear and demanding of action 20 years ago are still demanding of action today because we actually haven't met the bar that was set.
Okay, let me turn now to the Honorable Dr. Steve Cambone, who was the first Under Secretary of Defense for Intelligence and then went to work for industry at Kinetic and then now is standing up a curriculum. He's the Associate Chancellor of, for the cyber at Texas A&M.
Thank you, Bill, and good afternoon, everyone. I came to this subject as the recipient of the work that was done by Bill and Soup and a lot of the people in this room when I entered the department in 2001. And while we were attentive in the period prior to 9/11 to the problem, our minds became impressed with the issues associated with cyber and its aftermath, and particularly when we entered into the engagement in Iraq, and it became apparent that the explosion of social media and various ways of communicating outside of the ordinary channels that the military had been accustomed to addressing were now part of the national security landscape. And so that was my introduction to this issue. But rather than looking backwards, I'd like to take Bill's charge in thinking about implications for moving forward and maybe offer a thought or two about how we might think about this problem. So I went back and looked at the advent of electricity and the growth in productivity in the United States. Or you can go back and look at the same charts with respect to the advent of electricity in the early 1900s and the change in the allocation of horsepower, for example. And in both cases, the lines are very steep. The line for the increase in productivity in the United States with the introduction of electricity was about doubled over the course of maybe 50 years. And the IT revolution is bringing about roughly the same change. If you measure between 1970 and project out to 2020, you see about a doubling in productivity. So the implication there is that there is a massive societal effect that is taking place as a result of the introduction of this thing we're today calling cyber, and may call something tomorrow, but it's having a massive societal effect. But unlike in the past where the effect was sector bound, so as I say, go back and look at horsepower and you can see the changeover from literally horses on the farms to the use of tractors and see what the the growth and productivity was, or railroads and things like that. This is not confined to industrial sectors. It is ubiquitous in its effect. That is to say, we all carry some element of the cyber world on our hips, in our briefcases, in our homes. We're connected in a way that is wireless and easily accessing that international web of knowledge and entertainment and connectivity. And the growth is even greater than it had been in the past with electricity, for example. And the reason is that electricity in the 19th century or 20th century was done mostly in developed countries, or what we would today call developed countries. Much of the growth we see in the ICT sectors is taking place in developing countries. And those changes are taking place in a way that is fundamentally altering those societies, and it's being done with tools and equipment that is becoming less and less expensive to bring to bear. So I want to concentrate the remainder of this conversation for just a few moments on the nearly priceless, by which I mean to say almost free, microprocessor. And it's the microprocessor that is at the heart of this IoT revolution. And its cost, as being near to nothing, is the driver in its adaptation. So every device that, from your lock at home to your refrigerator that talks to you, to your coffee maker that makes your coffee in the morning, it has a microprocessor in it. And that microprocessor is connected to the world. And it is, for the most part, and I don't want to overemphasize here, but it is nearly without any security strictures whatsoever. Most of it is based on open source software coding. And while it is true that in the open source world, folks tend to look after to look for the vulnerabilities in that software, it's also the case that the software has many, many instances. And unless you're going to be trained to check first and foremost whether the instance you are going to pull out of the library has in fact had its vulnerabilities patched, you are likely inserting into your basic firmware and underlying software all the vulnerabilities that are necessary to enter into your system, or are capable of being in the system when you buy it, beaconing home to those who put the bugs in there in the first place. So we're in an environment where the notion, my friends at DSS like to talk about delivering product that was uncompromised, I think was the way they put it, to the federal government in particular. And it seems to me that given what we know about the nature of the ecosystem with which we are working, we've got to begin thinking about this problem as it's being delivered corrupted. Because if it's not corrupted when it's delivered to you, it is easily corruptible once it's in your hands, and it doesn't anymore take someone with the old thumb drive being stuck in to make it happen. It could be very much inherent in the software of the device that you've received. A second difference from the past, and it takes me on a second point, when you think about the railroads, for example, or even the telegraph and the telephone, there was an intimate relationship between the hardware and the activity that took place on it. But if you think about the railroad, you didn't corrupt a railroad by running trains down the railroad tracks, right? But today we have the hardware, and increasingly the software is an independent factor, right? And it's increasingly even running not so much on all the hardware, right? The wireless connectivity, yes, it gets back to hardware eventually, but the hardware acts as a vehicle for the very things capable of destroying both the hardware and that software activity that is of great interest and great value. So what does that mean? Well, if we think about where we're headed, we have to begin to change how we think about and how we address then these problems of as it was said this morning, I think of systems that we can trust versus those that are secure, And by trust, I think in that formulation, I would suggest it means that we understand its vulnerabilities, its the attack surfaces, and its present state of reliability relative to my interest. All right? And if I know all those things, I can begin to trust it. How do I get there? Well, many of the universities are beginning to change the way that they teach on this issue. A&M is one, Maryland is another. We can talk about Virginia Tech, Stanford. I mean, we can go down the list of George Mason out here in Northern Virginia. Many of the schools are trying to change the way that they bring up their engineers and bring them into the work environment. We've taken an approach that's focusing on three things: design and governance. So let's think from the beginning, how do we design and how do we govern the things we design? And that governance is not just governmental, it's also non-NGOs and things like the ISOC, which set standards and so forth. Second, it was mentioned this morning, we're going to transition for sure from where we are to something else. And understanding what the trend lines of that transition might be are important, one. And two, figuring out how to get from where we are to where we're headed and end up there in a better state than we are today is terribly important. So going from as is to be and thinking through what the implications of that are going to be, it seems to us is terribly important. And third, we really have to get back, and let me come back to my microprocessor, we really have to think our way through what the implications for security are going to be as that microprocessor today becomes something different in the future, right? And we need to figure out how it can affect, back to my point earlier about the societal changes, what kind of new opportunities is it going to bring, what kind of new use cases are going to emerge, and therefore how do we have to think about what security is going to look like 10 years, 15 years down the road, rather than worrying ourselves only about the problem we face today.
Great, thank you, Steve. So we have about 31 or 2 minutes left, and what I'd like to do from here, I'm going to actually make a few remarks about what I think are some educational framing issues you might think about. This is just a way to think about how educators might think about dealing with this topic, cyber, I/O, even space. That's just really microelectronics up there for the future. Again, bespeaks the breadth of this topic. Now, I did go into the UMUC's curriculum, actually, and passed around to all of my panel members. Surprisingly, the UMUC curriculum is very, very broad, as it is in other schools. It not only deals with technology issues, it deals with policy issues, it deals with law, it deals with other kinds of important things, or business practices, et cetera, that relate to this. But for the sake of just binning up ways that educators might want to think about this particular problem, based on the lessons learned from the now experience of 20 years, I'm going to try to, and this will reflect some of the complexity, I think, that's associated with this. The first category has to do with the technology, and we think about this as a technology problem, and therefore we go first to technology. So we think about education, we think about computer science, computer engineering, cryptology, cryptography, identity management, basic architecture design, the whole panoply of ICT that's out there, the IT and the comms, its related dependencies, the hardware, software, et cetera, that's associated with the grist, if you will, of the mill of the architectures that we have to deal with that are under assault or have to be protected. The second category, that a way you might think about it, has to do with what I call the sociology of cyber I/O space. The sociology to me is strategy, policy, doctrine. It has to do with how you would organize for success. One could take the position today, for example, that we have all these verticals in the system. Chris represents a vertical. These verticals are sort of busy doing their own thing. They're overwhelmed by the day-to-day activities. And that if we looked at the organizational side of this, you'd say, well, gee, we have too much organization maybe. I think we have a lot of vertical organization. The really important thing is, do we have the horizontal dynamics? And I'm really kind of surprised by the fact that we haven't tumbled to the idea, taking maybe even a page out of the Chinese model, that we need a cyber administration or a top-level cyber authority or a top-level cyber council. And this is going to connect to another dimension I'm going to talk about here in a minute, which has to do with leadership, not just leadership, but leadership in partnership with governance, strong industrial-grade governance. So the leaders that we need at the top cannot hide from this problem, which I think that they've been successfully doing for a while. So the sociological issues go into how do you get, we've already talked about best people, whether you're talking about journeyman, masters, what I call extreme team, elite team players, R&D, acquisition. The Defense Science Board has been saying that because cyber moves so fast, particularly on the government side, we need special authorities for acquisition. This is an authorities issue. It's a law issue. The FAR doesn't deliver to us what it is we need in the way of speed. We need an intelligence community like Section 5, Section 8 special authorities to acquire. If you get the turn rate up, and the turn rate itself is a defensive strategy. You're presenting new face of the adversary all the time. The whole public-private divide, spanning that to me, there's so many issues in there, you hardly know where to start. And that includes the dialogue, the business practices. I've already talked about the norms, the laws, the businesses that spin off on the side of that relate to insurance and all the rest of that. There's the new dimension of IO cyber, which is yet another topic which has already been talked about this morning, but I wonder whether we've sort of figured out how to place this in the pantheon of education relative to the technical and sociological. And that has to do with really what's the intent or the content that's being carried by the media that we care about, the ICT. This brings us to the influence, strategic communications, Maskarovka, active measures, disinformatia, all the kinds of things that are occurring. And at the very least, it seems to me from an academe point of view, we do need to study some history here because there's a rich history going back hundreds of years, actually, in these categories of influence, strategic communications, or whatever other kinds of terms you want to use, where one nation has tried to leverage another nation and do lots of things. But in an environment of social media, an environment of fake news, an environment of all the other things that we're having to live around today, we have to take the intent and the content, essentially, of what's in there and understand, and at the very least, there needs to be some kind of analytic organization, whether it's in the intel community or whether it's in other places, to sort of have a sense of understanding of what's essentially happening to us. Remember, the metrics, the mission metrics around cyber, degrade, deny, disrupt, corrupt, usurp, these are harsh words. These are tough mission words. And the words like corrupt, usurp, etc. are equally as difficult as deny, destroy. And essentially all of that is happening in these network environments. The next thing I'd like to talk about has to do with something I've already talked about. How do we get leaders more involved in this? I actually think there's been an absence of leadership here. At the beginning of the last administration, we had the CNCI, a whole blueprint, later revalidated at the very end of that administration, repeating very much what Melissa Hathaway did in the CNCI. And then we had 8 years of progress. John has talked about them, but it's insufficient progress. Essentially, leaders, in my view, are not engaged, and the secret to getting leaders engaged, in my view, are governance processes from which they cannot flee. There have to be program reviews. There have to be consistent reasons. There's the reason why President Xi goes in front of the cyber administration every couple of weeks and leads and sits with the leaders of the China cyber community. There's an area where obviously leadership is engaged. Leadership can't hide from these problems. The complexity, the other kinds of things that tend to want them to flee the problem because of the nature and character of it, in my view, they have to actually have the presentation of the factors associated with this particular thing. So I've laid out a whole bunch of issues that I think that are important from a framing point of view. I actually think that academe can think about how governance processes can be applied, business practices applied. After all, these are businesses, in order to get the leadership, whether it's public, classic private sector leadership, where I think today, actually, CEOs of corporations, risk officers, CSOs, CISOs, they're living in fear of breach because of what's essentially happening today. We need to get the leaders in Congress involved. After all, the draft laws they've had, barely what we get out of them is more enjoyment for sharing, this, that, and the other. We can actually do a lot better, and I think that we can actually cross legislative, executive lines if there was an aggressive, some kind of national cyber council, cyber IO council or something, but something else needed essentially at the top. Seemed to be missing something at the top. So let me move on from there and open it up to any comments that the rest of the group might have about how educators might think about doing things differently than they're doing now or expanding what it is they're doing. Any comments from anybody?
Why not? So I think broadly as a nation, we don't do a very good job at the very foundational levels of educating what technology is. And I think that goes to the K through 12 STEM education piece. We're not investing in the future. And it's kind of a cheesy way to put it. But I think until we actually commit ourselves at the most basic building blocks of understanding what the challenge is going forward, we're going to be continuing to fight this rearguard action. We're just not going to be able to get into position. Now, in terms of the workforce, I think there's a certain degree of fatalism or skepticism, whatever it is, that we continue to throw this workforce, cyber workforce challenge out. That's the thing that we have to solve. I don't think that's actually at all the problem we need to solve. I think we need to figure out how to take better advantage of the cyber security or the security consolidation that's taking place. So if I've got 1,000 billets within DHS that I need to fill, do I actually need to fill those 1,000 billets? Or do I need to figure out how to fill the key ones and then partner with security companies or industry on how to better bring in and leverage our core capabilities or competencies towards the same goal? One other thing that strikes me about this conversation, particularly the last few minutes, we're in a really strange place. I'm not sure if it's a inflection point or whatever, but when our critical infrastructure is effectively the target of nation-state attacks, that's a fundamentally different paradigm than we have been historically from physical attacks. When we talk about overseas, we have our military that's fighting the battles for it. But when it's incumbent upon our infrastructures to defend themselves, that's a question that I think we truly need to pull the thread on and figure out who is the responsible party for defending our critical infrastructure. Is it the critical infrastructures? Are they responsible for defending themselves? Yes or no? If it's no, who is there to help them? Is it the military, Department of Defense? Is it the civilian agencies? Is it the Department of Homeland Security? What is it? And that is an unresolved policy question that I look forward to that conversation going forward. And it's simply not an easy question. And I'll leave it at that.
Okay, any other comments? John?
Yes, sir. Here's an area where I think that industry and academia can take a leadership position. And the problem is much broader than just technology. But I'm going to focus on technology. Right now, in my view, and I've experienced this in the military and I'm seeing it in the private sector, the world of technology, and I'll include information technology, operational technology, and as those two are increasingly connected, the Internet of Things. That world and the world of the security designed to protect it are moving in opposite directions. And what do I mean by that? 6 major trends. In the world of technology, things are becoming simpler to understand and easier to use. Just look at your iPhone and apps. Things are becoming more convenient. Like one of the apps is Uber, push a button, get a car. It's taking fewer and fewer people to do more and more things in that world. Things are becoming increasingly connected, designed natively to work together so that you don't have to figure out how to make these different types of technologies work together. They come to you as a package. Things are increasingly automated. And finally, things are designed to solve problems proactively. Now, if you look at the world of the security designed to protect that world, it's moving in exactly the opposite direction. Instead of easier to understand and use, it's becoming more difficult. Instead of being convenient, it's becoming more complicated. Just look at password complexity requirements or security product orchestration in a network environment. Instead of doing more with fewer people, it's requiring more and more people to do more and more things. I don't know of a single organization, public or private, that has told me I've got all the people that I need. By some estimates, by 2020, there's going to be a 1.5 million shortage in cybersecurity professionals. Instead of becoming more automated, the world of security is still largely stuck in legacy thinking about, response, manual response based on human decision making. And then finally, instead of being designed to proactively solve problems in the world of security, we're always in the response mode. We are chasing after problems. We're not designed, we don't have a prevention mindset. And I do believe, in my experience, 10 years in cyber in the military, there wasn't a single incident that wasn't totally preventable. So can you prevent everything? No. But I believe you can wipe most of the noise off the radar screen so that you can use your people for the really tough problems. The challenge is, how do you do that? And I think innovation, this is where I talked about we can't afford to do incremental change. This is the crossroads of today. Industry and academia, perhaps led by a government moonshot type effort, needs to solve that, needs to innovate to solve those problems, to take the world of security and make it do a U-turn so it lines up with making things easier, making things more convenient, requiring fewer people, making things designed to be connected rather than bolted on. If I compared cybersecurity to the automotive industry, what we have today in the cybersecurity world is a bunch of folks going out to 100 different auto parts stores and buying parts and trying to build the car themselves, rather than going to a dealership and buying something that's built, designed to work together. That's what's happening. We need to solve that problem, and I think that is something that requires a bold ideas, a moonshot idea. I know today's NSTAC is working on that. They've already talked about making this perhaps a government-led, but partnered with industry and academia to be able to do this. That's where I think leadership is required.
David?
Just to respond in two ways. First, I do support a sort of moonshot idea for making the technology plane more defensible, since I've been hearing for more than 10 years in this business that our current COTS level technologies are not ultimately defensible, at least in an efficient manner. So absolutely, we can talk about how we get there organizationally or politically, but I think that's absolutely a way to go. I guess I'm a little concerned that in talking about the security world versus the IT world, we're sort of making it backwards a little bit. After all, a lot of the technologies we get from the IT world are designed and produced by people who either have never heard of a security principle, or they abjure responsibility for the security risks that their products impose on their customers. So there is something called risk shifting in the governance literature on IT and other issues, especially pollution as well, where end user license regimes and the principal agent issues of what customers know versus what technology developers know, that allows producers of IT goods and services to evade responsibility and evade accountability. The ones creating the infrastructure, the technology infrastructure that we want to defend, are not the security companies. And I think there's obviously blame to go around, but the fundamental responsibility is for companies I won't name that produce devices we all carry around, or devices that we use as part of our ordinary business processes. While they are indemnified from accountability from the risks they introduce into society, we're not likely to get very rapid progress. And I think that's a sort of fundamental accountability point that goes to the governance issue, and it's critical infrastructure, and it's beyond critical infrastructure as well. And that is, again, something that was clear as far back as Y2K. It was probably clearer before that. It's certainly clear today when we have the levels of breach activity where the actual costs imposed on C-level officials, even those that get fired, are small compared to the risk that's deflected onto their millions of customers. I'll remind you that it's only a couple of weeks ago that 143 million Equifax customers got another increment to the risk that they have to live with for the rest of their lives, or the 3 billion account holders from Yahoo who suddenly discovered that the entire user base had their information compromised for a decade. You know, Target and other, you know, the litany of breaches that we have where those who have sensitive information under their fiduciary control aren't held accountable for violations of that basic security requirement.
Any other comments? No. Let me just conclude this particular section. We have about 15 minutes left, and we'll get to the Q&A in just a minute. You know, in addition to the things we talked about, there are these really big, overarching, big problems out there that have emerged in the last 20 years. Obviously, insider is one of them. Electromagnetic pulse, the ultimate cyber weapon, is another interesting issue. The dark web, you can talk about the emergence of Bitcoin and blockchain, supply chain, theft of intellectual property. There are all these huge, important macro strategic issues that have emerged over this period of time that also have to be dealt with and provide context in the context of how you would think about education for the future. Now, I'm going to do something I probably shouldn't do. I'm going to switch over here to make sort of ask everybody to make a final assessment of the cyber now posture, our cyber now posture. I'm going to go to the most pessimistic end of the spectrum here and provide some notional comments here in order to sort of set the stage from this, and then we can back our way away from this. My metric for the country in the cyber area is that we be sufficiently stable and resilient. Now, we are nowhere near, in my view, being sufficiently stable and resilient in the cyber I/O area. And I don't believe we're actually moving with the kinds of speed that we need to close that gap. I think we're continuing to admire the problem in some dimensions, and one could make a case whether it's getting worse or better, or whether we just know more about individual attacks that are ongoing, that have interesting dimensions to them. But clearly, if I use the Wall Street Journal number of articles on cyber as a metric every day, in the last 7 days of issues, there have been 7 major stories, whether it's Russia interfering on NATO radios, whether it's any of the other things that we've already talked about. I really wonder whether it's actually going to take the cyber Pearl Harbor. I do not believe that we are necessarily angry enough at this point. I think we're continuing to admire the problem. I think we continue to live mostly in the patch and pray or failure to patch world. So not enough attention is going into some of the key areas. High leverage R&D. Well, there are high leverage R&D areas we can move into. There are obviously ongoing activities out there. The fundamental design of the basic processor. Is there an inherently secure processor out there? And how does that relate to the design of other pieces of the components? Equities management that relates to things like how would you apply encryption? How would you apply pervasive identity management? Not only identity for people, but identity for things. That kind of thing, if you really got serious and went for the leverage, and who's going to manage and decide on what those possible high leverage areas are, and more importantly, since it's going to cost billions to get there on top of the billions we're already spending, it's hard to know. The other thing is best practices. All these companies that are asking, do I spend 4% on cyber? Do I spend 20% on cyber? The problem with the power grids ever since the EMP Commission is they run from anything that looks like it's going to be a cost and a risk to them, and it's a cost-risk trade-off, and they don't want to pass it on to the ratepayers, and they have trouble moving except quietly, essentially, in certain selective kinds of dimensions. So again, I think this is important. So what does all this mean? If we're what this adds up to is, to a degree, we're jeopardizing our future based on our present state. And so that's where the next panel will start, is how are they going to figure out how we're going to get a better life from a point of view of where we are now and accelerate. I would suggest to you that's what's required here is some form of mobilization, national mobilization. This is one of the top 1 or 2 or 3 threat areas to the country. It touches everything. And so the real issue here is how can we get to a blitz mode to deal with all the kinds of large-scale factors that we're already talking about, to have them coalesce and come together in some order so that we can get on top of this. And I would suggest organizing for success is one way to do it. We've already talked about getting leadership engaged. We talked about bridging the public-private divide. There's been some skepticism based post-Snowden and other factors about whether that could ever be managed. I think the quasi-government organizations standing between the private industry and the U.S. government and foreign governments, et cetera, can do a good job of essentially being the translation mechanism that was discussed this morning. So let me sort of throw that out there as a sort of an over-the-top assessment, and then I would be happy to have anybody else back us away from that, and then we'll have 5 minutes for Q&A. Any comments?
One comment, I agree with most of that, but I preserve the capacity for hope that we'll do better than we have for the last 20 years. I mean, I think that past is prologue in this area, that we are not doing the simple things. If we can't do those, doing the more difficult ones, like redesigning the technology infrastructure for the country, strikes me as maybe a bridge too far. But I hope that's not true, but it might be.
Okay, anybody want to step up to the mics now and ask some questions for the panelists? Okay, they're really coming.
Hi, I'll make this quick. My name is Nora Graves. I'm the director of the Hampton Roads region for the University of Maryland, University College. I work with the military. I'm also the recent past president of Virginia ACME, which is Virginia Advisory Council on Military Education. And I have been meeting with quite a few Virginia representatives from the universities in Virginia. And as you said, George Mason currently has a cybersecurity engineering degree that is part of the CAE program. However, the Virginia schools do not work very effectively with the military, and the military is a huge factor in the state of Virginia. So UMUC is doing very well in the state of Virginia for that reason. But what I'm seeing, and I would like your input as people who are dealing in academia, is that I see this as a perfect storm that's going on right now. We have this massive new GI Bill that has been introduced to our military, in addition to the exorbitant costs of higher education coming together with the need for technical education that is constantly changing. And I don't think universities, or the traditional universities, are really stepping up to the challenge of the need to change very dynamically. They're still working in silos that are ultimately hurting higher ed in technology.
You want to take that?
I'll say one thing. The University of Maryland system, I work for College Park, so not UMUC directly, but I know every time I think that we, in the School of Public Policy, are going to start a new initiative, I see colleague institutions within the University of Maryland system engaging with members of the recently civilianized, I suppose, members of the military who are using the benefits that were mentioned for customized programs. And we have a number of statewide initiatives from UMBC, University of Maryland, Baltimore, and University of Maryland College Park that try and engage both with Fort Meade and with National Guard to transition people from the service to industrial domains where they can use skills or learn new ones. So I think you're onto something. I can't really comment on how Virginia does that.
I left it off my list, but I actually think that academe can be more effectively involved, whether it's through STEM or through intern programs or whatever, in the whole business of thinking about conflict in cyberspace generally, and even military conflict and combat. There's a lot of information in the public domain or things that you can speculate about, I think, that would allow you to get your head around the nature of conflict and even connect with the military operations side of this, at least from a point of view of strategy. Take a look. The DoD strategy for cyber is a public document. It has a lot of implications associated. If you look at every one of those bullets for what is the strategy, you can talk about those for a long time. So I think if you do some research, you can actually find some ways to swim through this. Next.
Okay. Hello, can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
My name is Senator Susan Lee. I'm in the Maryland State Senate. I'm also a member of the Maryland Cybersecurity Council that's staffed ably by the University of Maryland University College. My question is, it seems that to all you esteemed panelists, it seems that there's a lot of patchwork and kind of a piecemeal approach to approaching everything cyber, from what we should be doing. Should we be prioritizing what's important? Are agencies working together? Who's in charge? And particularly liability issues, things like incentives,
right,
and defining what we should do next. It doesn't seem like there's maybe a coordinated effort and strategy. I think that the only thing that I've seen on a national level is when they passed CISA, and that was a good first step. But there's still a lot of liability issues that I see that are probably not answered. And where do you see us going? Do you think we should do this on a legislative level, or should the president be doing this, or should we be doing this all simultaneously?
Comments, anybody?
So I think as the conversation today has demonstrated, this is a cross-functional issue that's going to go across civilian, private sector, military assets, which gets you into a number of different kind of statutory and title whatever, what have you, implications. So it's not as simple as a piece of legislation that gets everything back together under one umbrella. In terms of how to do it, it's going forward. I think Executive Order 13800 that the President signed out earlier this year is at least a simple step forward in terms of organizing the thought process and the strategy around it. The President has directed the development of a national security strategy and a new national cybersecurity strategy underneath that. And I think I saw Rob Joyce maybe speaking, I'm not sure. Anyway, he's on point, this President's cybersecurity coordinator. More importantly, I think it's a lot of what it's going to take is leadership and effort and commitment to working together. One of the things that I've done within my organization, again, is this cross-functional matrixing approach, whether you're physical, you're cyber, whatever the asset is to execute mission, whether it's, for example, election infrastructure. I'm taking whatever I can across my organization, reaching out into the department's intelligence and analysis function, grabbing people, reaching out to the FBI, grabbing people. We have a single mission to ensure that our nation's election infrastructure is secure, not just for 2018, but the upcoming state elections. This is a no-fail mission. I'm going to do what it takes with a sense of urgency to get it done. I don't care where the resources or assets come from. We are going to get the job done. Now, that's a mindset. That's a way of approaching a problem. Is that a structure? Is that a governance structure on top of it? No, but we're going to work towards that in state with just internal commitment on top of it. Happy to kick it over to others.
I would just make one comment. I do believe that this issue is fundamentally a distributed issue because the digital environment is fundamentally a distributed environment. So in my view, partnerships and teamwork are the key to success. And I would caution, Senator, about too much regulation, too much oversight, because one of the risks involved in consolidating everything and just laying the law down is what you'll do in an environment that's this dynamic with the threat and the actual technology that's changing at such a rapid pace is you'll lock yourself into something that's obsolete. And so I would caution that that's the challenge, is trying to find the right balance, because we are at a crossroads. Things need to be done, but they need to be done very carefully, and I think partnerships and teamwork are probably a more effective approach.
The balance is the key issue. I think you can't have standards, regulation, penalties without incentives and rewards and togetherness. So, Steve, do you want to say?
Yeah, just two things. A point was made here about risk transference. Insisting that the risk not be transferred is not necessarily an inhibition to innovation. It may drive up the cost of innovation some, and it will drive up the cost of that processor, right? Because if as the provider I bear the risk, then I have to insure against it, and I have to pass that cost to you. So there's a conversation that has to take place about where that risk ought to sit. Second, the issues of insurance then are associated with risk. And to the extent that the insurance matches the risk over against the warranty, right, there's a mechanism in there to begin to force the market to adjust and therefore the consumer to adjust to the nature of the risk that they're prepared to take on board. Because in the end, it is the ubiquity of the system that is the heart of the risk. And to the extent that the major users in the system, namely us, are prepared to accept those risks, then we open that system up to the very vulnerability that we contend we're looking to avoid. So somehow that trade has got to be brought forward to the public in a way that causes them to understand that in the end, making that trade-off is essential. On the education side, you know, academic institutions, despite their reputations, are enormously conservative places. And so mechanisms need to be found in the universities to allow them to do the kind of educational process you're talking about, because turning a program around inside of one semester is nigh on impossible. I'll bet if you go to the registrar, you'll find out that the classrooms for the spring of 19 have already been assigned. It's worse than the federal government budgeting process, ladies and gentlemen. So some mechanism is going to have to be found to allow for more flexibility in dealing with that workforce issue raised.
With that comment, the Now panel is concluded, and I would certainly like to thank my fellow panelists and wish them well, sir.
Great. Yeah.